Welcome to Reinvent and our new series, Reinvent the Humanities to Change the World. This is done in partnership with Georgetown University, and it's the second series we've done with Georgetown. I'm Pete Leyden, and I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm here to introduce Kathryn Temple, who's the chair of the English department of Georgetown. She is essentially taking the lead for this series from Georgetown's point of view, and she will be driving a one-on-one interview today, and she is going to introduce our guest. Kathryn?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Of course, I haven't been the chair since July 1, for which I'm extremely grateful. So that's actually what's giving me the time and to explore this interest and be involved with this project. So I'm really happy with that. So I want to welcome Sid Smith today. She is a professor at University of Michigan and the director of the Humanities Center there. And she's been involved in many activities over the years promoting the humanities both within the academy and out in the world. So she's a wonderful person to start our interview series with. I'm particularly interested because she has a book coming out, and what is the date of that, Sid?
The open access version will be the first or second week in November, and the paperback in early January.
And it's very exciting because it's something we know that she's been working on for years, partly in her role as MLA president, which I think completed in 2012, 2010. And I remember very well her speaking eloquently about this when she was president of MLA. So it's great to get to meet you virtually and to welcome you to the series. The title of the new book is Manifesto for the Humanities, Transforming Doctoral Education in Good Enough Times. But the book really takes up all kinds of issues about the humanities in the academy and outside the academy, the value of the humanities, and those are of interest to us as well as the doctoral education issues. So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about was you have such an interesting history. I mean, you have really spanned a sea change in academia. And when I was reading about your early experiences in the book in the 1960s, working on your own graduate education, what I was hoping was that you would just talk a little bit about the evolution from then to now.
The reason I wrote about myself in the book, and I'm a longtime scholar of life writing. I've written a lot on genres and politics and the social uses of life writing, and I have written very little about myself. But in the context of writing the book, I began to think about how it is that people talk about the good old days in the academy. And since the good old days, it's a problematic phrase, I began to think about, well, maybe I'd put my story in a little bit about what it was like when I came through at in the late 60s, early 70s, and how complicated things were then and how much needed to change, just like it needs to change now. So I have a particular view of the changes that has to do with my work as a feminist scholar and as somebody who started out at the University of Arizona working with other women there and developing a women's studies program, which came on in about 1975, and kind of toughing out those days, making a case for changing the academy, the curriculum, both in the social sciences and the humanities and across the university broadly. And those were complicated days, and a lot of us who had the experience of trying to change the academy and make it more inclusive of the kinds of curriculum that we were interested in, of career advancement for women and people of color, we had to work very hard to make those changes. So for me, the academy is always under pressure and always changing. Mm-hmm. And writing this book gave me an opportunity to think about how to talk about what needs to change now.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's interesting to think about 60s and 70s were this pivotal moment, and there's been a lot of change. And when you look at English departments now, for instance, you see a lot more women, at least at the associate level, if not at the full level. You see a woman president of MLA, which I don't think you saw very often 20, 30, 40 years ago. But now it seems like we're at another point of change. That seems like another really major hinge. So could you talk a little bit about how you see that evolving?
Well, I still, there's a couple ways to come at that issue about the changes now. There's radical changes in the academy because of the massive withdrawal of public support for public higher education and the kinds of difficulties that is created for universities, and universities, not only the flagship universities like Michigan, but the regional state universities and the universities that are in the large cities across the country, for the community colleges, for the state university systems. So there's what's commonly talked about as the corporatization of the university, the way in which the practices of the university have changed so that the university is a location now that's kind of infiltrated by a lot of the discourse that comes out of corporate practice, corporate projects, corporate agendas. So that's one thing. The second thing is this radical transformation of the way in which scholars teach and do their work now, and the way it's communicated, and that has to do with the transformation because of the digital. And that affects what's happening to university presses, the whole apparatus for communicating scholarship, and there's some tenuousness about what's happening in the humanities, what's happening, something called the book in its codex form, and what's going to happen to the book, and how are we going to disseminate our work now. So, and that also affects how we're teaching now, and the kind of pressures on faculty in the classroom to adjust to all of the new technologies of social media, and to think about how to take what's best in the changes that are occurring and make the classroom experience a more an experience that speaks to students now who are being changed by the lives they live in the midst of digital media. So those are about 4 different changes that are occurring. The other thing that's happening is because of the issues with access, because of the time that it's required, and I'm thinking right now particularly in terms of doctoral education, because of the time that's required now in doctoral education in the humanities, the long years it takes, the amount of money in debt that is accrued, we're seeing all of our commitments to making the humanities more diverse, for attracting all kinds of students. We're having trouble again keeping attention on attracting diverse people from underrepresented communities, first-generation students, and providing them with the kinds of support and energies that will make them want to do a doctorate in the humanities, become teachers in the classroom, or go out into other careers and take their doctoral training with them. So that's about 4 large kind of challenges that we have right now.
Okay, so I thought one of the really interesting things in the beginning of the book was you were talking about the critiques of the humanities and the critiques of doctoral education, and one of them has been, as you know, there are no jobs in the academy, and so we should shut down these doctoral programs because people won't be able to get jobs. And you pointed out that those kinds of arguments generally come from elite folks who tend to have the very kind of education that they're now willing to shut down. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the issue about shutting down doctoral programs because we don't need more doctorally trained humanists, because there aren't jobs for them in the universities after they finished. It comes from both outside, that's the people on the outside with a more kind of approaching the notion of higher education from a kind of utilitarian or utilitarian position, that higher education should lead to the first job, and that in times that are tough and in times when states can't afford to support their university systems in the way that they have in the past, universities should focus on those kinds of degrees that will be immediately transferable to jobs in the outside world. So that's one place that the call for we don't need any more doctorates in the humanities comes from. It also comes from the inside of the academy, with people suggesting, some colleagues suggesting that we should close down doctoral programs so that we're not training as many people, and the pressure on the job market will decrease. And you know, I'm most interested in trying to talk to my colleagues and talk to those within the academy about what that means to call for closing down doctoral programs. I mean, from my point of view, you can never have too many doctorally trained people in the U.S. and around the world. That is the quality of mind, the disposition they bring, their critical skills, their ability to write, to speak, to kind of look at complex problems from all different points of view. We need as many of those people as we can, whether it's in the academy or outside of the academy. So that's kind of to the external people critiquing the overabundance of people doing doctoral degrees in the humanities. For my colleagues, what I'd say is that I never hear the next step taken about, okay, let's close down this program, this program, this program, and this program. Nobody says whose programs are going to close down. It's just that they should close down.
Right.
And again, because I was trained at Case Western Reserve, doctorally trained at Case Western Reserve, which is not among the elite publics or the elite privates, I've always been a proponent of the importance of all the different kinds of doctoral programs we have at different kinds of institutions. And that's the strength of doctoral training in the United States, that it's not entirely cookie cutters reproducing the exact same images of the people who are already at those institutions, that there are a lot of different kinds of institutions, and that we need to claim that as a real strength of the American system and not see it as expendable.
Okay, so this is wonderful to hear, because I'm hearing wonderfully articulated responses to questions I've been getting at conferences and across the country about efforts we made at Georgetown to start a PhD program. And I think I want to focus a little bit on the issue of what are often called non-traditional students.
Yes.
So I work with a lot of non-traditional students, and many of them are very interested in doctoral education in the humanities. But one of the issues for them is they're seldom positioned to be able to go full-time to a program, for instance, even out of state. They're very seldom positioned to do that. So one of our goals when we announced this new possible program at Georgetown was to create a program that would be more hospitable to those kinds of students. And the reaction was, well, you'll never get those students jobs in the academy, and that's how we measure the quality of the programs, and so this is not a viable program for us today. And I just find it very, very disappointing that we're not thinking about these non-traditional students, because the capabilities out there and the potential out there is immense, and we're basically wasting it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of interventions you could see in PhD programs in the humanities that would make them more available to non-traditional students.
Well, the reason, the way I thought about this and the angle I took towards this larger issue, and this is an issue about thinking about the need to have greater and greater diversity in the kinds of students we bring into programs, in the experiences they bring with them, and in the experiences that they take away and the skills they take away. And for me, the issue that's really important is how we conceptualize the dissertation. And I know that that seems to be a back-ended way of getting at a very important question, but we have, my frustration about the conversations, they're beginning to change now. A lot is changing right now. We're in this great moment. And, but up until now, there has been a sense that the dissertation is the dissertation. It is the kind of given, and it's the kind of writing this proto-monograph, writing a book-like thing. That is what the humanities produce. That is what the students have to produce in order to go on to produce books in the future. And what I've seen is a form that is inadequate to the 21st century, and it is stifling for a lot of students. That is, it's a form through which doctoral programs bend students towards a certain very fixed and rigid way of thinking about what a doctorally trained humanist is. And instead of what I try and make the case in this book for a more capacious notion of what the possibilities might be for something we call a dissertation, that students will have more, a larger role in defining for themselves and engaging faculty around. And I think that if we open up our idea about what this final product is and think of it as not a singular entity, but as a kind of project in the making that the student is working toward, we will be able to attract people who will see that there's flexibility in programs and that they don't have to think about, well, at the end of my classwork, I'm now going to face 3, 4, maybe 5 years writing this long book, book-like form. And how can I think about what the cost of that's going to be to me, what the psychic cost it requires to kind of always think that there's only one way that I can finish this degree. So I do think this has an implication for addressing the issues that are brought to us by different kinds of students that want to get doctoral training.
Okay. So, yeah, and we talked about this when we were at McGill on the PhD retreat they had up there, and I was in a couple of panels where we were talking about alternatives to the PhD, to the standard dissertation. And of course, I think we've all heard about the graphic novel that came out of Columbia, which is very interesting to look at. But I wondered if you had come across any other types of projects, different types of projects that somehow, qualify as a dissertation in a humanities program. They develop some of the same skills, but they're alternatives to the book-length project that no one will ever read.
Well, of course, the most common one that people talk about is a suite of essays. And, I mean, there are departments in the humanities that have that as the dissertation. Philosophy does, linguistics sometimes does. And so that would kind of be in line with, if we think about the common modes of circulating our work now are in the long book form and the short essay form, that would kind of track a more traditional way of thinking about how it is that humanists write. But we can also, I mean, we're seeing more and more students, of course, who are working in digital cultures, digital humanities, digital environments, who are developing new kinds of projects. There's a graduate student, and I will not remember the name right now. There's a graduate student who did a information science degree at Michigan, master's, and then is now at Maryland at MIF. And she's doing a digital Ulysses project that's very complicated and very interesting. And people can go on MIF, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, and see what the digital Ulysses project is. And she's not the only one. There's more and more, more and more sessions are set up now at the National Association meetings where these new model dissertations are being presented by the graduate students who are working on them. So there's the kind that are developing in digital, are born digital, are maximizing the use of digital affordances and platforms. There are also, if you think about people, there's a lot of interest, of course, now in comparative literature and translation studies. And there's a lot that could be done to open up the dissertation to projects that are scholarly and translation projects. If you think about the amount of the world's literature that hasn't been translated yet, and the ways in which contributing to the translation of literature across the world really makes a difference in ways that a kind of traditional thinking about the monograph dissertation may or may not. Many of them don't go anywhere. Some of them do. Some of them are brilliant. So there could be translation projects. There could be portfolios of multiple kinds of projects. Say there are people who are interested, as you are, in public humanities work, projects that would be a portfolio of something that's done as a public humanities project, something that might be writing on pedagogy, as well as doing theoretical essay, as well as doing some other kind of project. So, we can't say what they'll all be, but what we can do is give students the agency to think about what is the best way of pursuing the project that they feel passionately about.
Yeah, and
actually, could I ask a question in that kind of way? Do you mind jumping in here?
Sure.
Yes, Sydney. Because a lot of what's interesting about this series is it's both talking to the people inside academia, but also outside academia.
Yeah.
And there is this kind of sense for people outside academia to kind of get a reappreciation of the contributions that the humanities in general, but also the humanities PhDs in particular might bring to the table here, and get people to rethink that a little bit about where is the role of the humanities, and particularly in a challenging time of now when we have a lot of mounting challenges, global challenges, new kinds of challenges in the 21st century here. And so I like your kind of translation. I would just like to stretch that a little further and say, I mean, do you see ways that what's happening in your field there, particularly around these PhDs, that there is kind of real opportunities here to actually translate even further into the workplace and into different kind of spaces that are increasingly relevant to broader and broader folks out there? Any thoughts on how some of that's going on now?
Sure. As I was thinking about how to situate this project, I got really interested in thinking about the ways in which humanists in the academy are part of a large population of people who do the humanities outside the academy. Mm-hmm. And I like to think of, there's two ways of thinking about this. One is that humanists inside the academy have a lot of allies out there, the lay people that go to museums, that go on archaeological digs, that sing music, that do oral history projects, that read books, that follow film or become film buffs. There are a lot of humanists out there, out in the world, and millions of them, millions of people, just in the United States. And one of the things that the National Association of Museums puts out on its website, and I won't get the figures right, but far more millions of people go to museums across the country in the United States every year than go to athletic events. We are a museum-going people. People go to museums in small towns. So all of those institutions are dependent on the humanities workforce. There are doctorally trained humanists in many of the museums that are around the country. And there are doctorally trained humanists who are teaching in secondary schools. And they are in public policy think tanks. And they're working for government. And they're working in the corporate sphere. So we've got these two formations. The humanities workforce, all of those people who are trained as humanists, who are out there in different spheres. And then we have all the people who are everyday humanists. And so I think there's a tremendous synergy that moves back and forth between the academy and the outer world. And we sometimes don't articulate that in ways that speak to how it is that people in these various in communities or in different workplaces think about themselves. So that would be my response to this. And there's also, Kathryn is interested in the public humanities. I have a lot of colleagues here, and there are many humanities institutes that are doing more and more on issues of public policy and public humanities work, and who are working on projects that link humanists in the academy on projects that are looking at the grand challenges, sustainability, cultures of incarceration, these large issues. So there's, I see just as the kind of the vibrancy of the humanities in the academy depends on drawing people to our programs that are from all different places, both geographically but communally, from experiential history. Our public sphere and our private lives are enhanced by all the humanists that are out there working across the country and the world.
I hear you. One other just little follow on that, and happy to turn it back here, but you said something very interesting about how more PhDs in general, just, kind of implying PhDs in general, but in terms of it's good for the world, it's more thinking people, more critically thinking, more, with the skill sets you mentioned there. Could you build a little bit on that? Because this is a theme that we've been trying to tease out, or want to tease out a little bit more in this series, is to what extent a humanist PhD, someone with but not just a PhD training, but particularly the humanism or the humanities background, how that might be kind of transferable into all these other kind of spaces that people might not traditionally be thinking about. You made some reference briefly there, but any thoughts on that, actually, of what kind of mind that training is and where that might actually be applied in places that we don't traditionally think about?
Well, I think this is true not only for doctorally trained, but for baccalaureate trained graduates who get out and go into the workplace. I mean, there are the set of skills that they bring: an ability to write, an ability to read deeply, carefully, an ability to speak and present issues, and an energy, a kind of energy for analysis and critical thinking. Now, those are all the skills, and our undergraduates who leave the academy with bachelor's in English and history and philosophy and anthropology, they take those skills into the workforce. But it's also for those who are trained at going on, doctorally trained. It's also all of those activities that are involved in defining a question that you want to pursue, locating archives, amassing a kind of knowledge, parsing out what the pieces of a larger project are, working through the complexities of making an argument, keeping passion alive, being open to being, diverted into a new direction because something comes into view that you didn't anticipate would come into view. All of that disposition to pursuing a kind of intense pathway of thinking, of analyzing, and of trying to communicate around some large question or issue, all of that as well is taken into whatever area they go into, whether it's working for nonprofits or NGOs or in human rights or in corporate offices or in public policy locations or for government or in the schools or in museums, or whether or not they start their own businesses. All of that is a kind of ensemble of tasks, of experiences, dispositions, skills that they have at hand.
So that's very connected to what I'd wanted to talk with you about a little bit more. And that you quote Peter Jay's book, The Crisis in the Humanities Crisis book, in your book, and mentioned he has a 21st century vision of the humanities motivated by engagement beyond the academy, right? And I keep thinking, and this is something we think a lot about at Georgetown in the Futures Initiative, what is the academy going to look like, 25 years from now? If you think of 25 years ago, we didn't have Google, we didn't have YouTube, right? So, what is it going to look like 25 years from now? And one thing I think about a lot is the idea of, public humanities is usually thought of as outreach, right? But what about the idea of inreach? So that, you could imagine a company having a humanities person assigned in the same way that hospitals sometimes have an ethicist, now a medical ethicist assigned to them. So I'm just wondering if we fantasize a little bit about how that might work itself out in the future, what that person would bring, say, to a corporation or a law firm or some commercial enterprise.
Well, what we have seen, of course, is in the academy, we have a whole set of in-reaching from all of the different positions now that are new kinds of positions. Like in the libraries, we have doctorally trained humanists who have become absolutely central. And we have a lot of humanists who are doctorally trained within the academy. And I think that because of the issues around helping or encouraging doctoral students to think about multiple futures ahead of them instead of just one future, that we're going to see this, and doctoral programs are doing this now. They're tapping their own graduates who are out there in a lot of different locations, in corporations, in law firms, in nonprofits, in medicine, and they are going to, I think they're going to put together these networks of advocates that are going to create this movement across the academy and into different work situations and into different professions. And we're seeing that some of the foundations are trying to develop these programs for doctorally trained humanists to work on projects and on internships out there. So I think that's one of the ways in which there's going to be, we're not, in doctoral education, and I'm talking about that because that's what I'm passionate about right now, but in doctoral education, we're going to see over the next 25 years a way in which there's more fluidity between the academy and the professions on the outside. And not just professions, just different kinds of work environments on the outside.
I'm very much looking forward to that. You know, I was a lawyer before I got my PhD in English, and when I look back on that career, it feels very much to me like the PhD in English would have helped me quite a bit in just stepping outside the box that you get into when you're practicing law. But I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, because I think this is something that academics talk a lot about, but perhaps the general public doesn't think about that much. This concept of the post-human and the role of the humanist in the post-human world. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what it means to say post-human and to imagine a post-human world.
Well, in my book, one of the chapters is on the post-human humanist scholar, and I see it as both. I mean, it's got its upside and its downside. So this is a complicated thing because there's so many strands of post-humanist thought, and this isn't the place to parse them. But it's a way, if we think about the way of asking questions so that human beings aren't at the center of both the notion of who it is that can know something, how we know something, and what is our term of referent, the human being, then we begin to think about how it is that we are part of a much larger ensemble or network or assemblage of entities, and the importance of understanding that, just like we have to with the grand challenge of global climate change and issues of sustainability. We have to think not just as human beings thinking about other human beings, but amassing all the resources we can to engage the issue and think about it on a broader scale. So that's one way, and humanists are a part of this new thinking about turning the lens away from the human as the center of the universe, the center of thinking. There's another way in which we are becoming post-humanist scholars, and that is that we are increasingly going to become, and this is true of humanists as well as other scholars in the academy, we're going to be dependent on, we are dependent on our devices, our platforms, people who aren't digital humanists, and I'm not talking about even the digital humanists, all of us use our platforms now. Archivists, the historians that go into archives, use their cameras, use their devices in order to do their work. And so we're becoming prosthetically extended by all of the devices. And we are going to be dependent on these ensembles of people and things and algorithms and code and cloud and software and fleshware, and to be able to do the work that we want to do, because we're going to take on collaborative projects more commonly in the humanities, and we're going to take on larger projects that are not thinkable without a team of people. So that's the upside for me of post-humans, the thinking about a post-human scholar. The downside, of course, is that we're becoming quantified, and we're having to report more and more numbers and depending on algorithms to present to people who are making decisions about our careers our impact, whether it's through citation indexes or all of the ways in which we have to quantify ourselves. So there's a kind of downside to it. But I also see excitement in thinking about understanding oneself in a different way as a humanities scholar.
Well, it's almost like the humanities scholar self is becoming distributed across these different platforms, and there's this idea of the expandable brain, right? And that makes me think of your discussion of the distributed university book, which I thought was really exciting, again, from the position of the non-traditional student. The distributed university is a lot more hospitable to non-traditional students than the sort of traditional undistributed university. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean by distributed university?
Well, a lot of people have talked about aspects of this. I got to, when I was trying to organize this book is in 3 parts. The second part is kind of how our environment is changing and how we as humanists are going to be changed by it. And the first thing I thought about is where is the where of higher education? Where is the where of the university? Or where is the there of the university? And so then I started thinking about all the ways in which the there-ness of the university is no longer the same there-ness that we used to think about, which was bricks and mortar, IP, whatever, and that universities are building campuses elsewhere around the world. That has good effects, bad effects. That the curriculum can be coming in from different places. That the classroom can be distributed. That and we know what do I want to say? The dramatic ways that's talked about. That's talked about through MOOCs, the MOOC. But MOOCs, there was a rise and a kind of fall, and the MOOCs are passé, not that they won't be influential, but the time of the MOOC is changed. But not the idea that there's ways in which education become more accessible to more kinds of students. And people have a lot of problems. Some people applaud what John Crow is doing at Arizona State. Some people think it's the end of higher education. But there is there's an experiment going on there about making a baccalaureate education accessible to more and more students through a combination of online, offline learning environments. So, and we know that people are talking more and more at very place-based institutions as well as distributed institutions about internships, about experiences abroad. That's another way in which the curriculum gets distributed into different environments. So I think that's only going to continue to gain momentum.
All right. And I think it's interesting. I just came from teaching a group of students about Thomas Jefferson, and we went down to Monticello, and it was, the whole experience of the way they're teaching things in Monticello now is very different than it was 20 years ago. So they're really giving, communicating a lot about the life of the enslaved people there, really, unpacking Jefferson's message in light of that. And so to me, it was like the whole humanities experience in one 12-hour day.
Right.
So, and that made me think about so I sort of know what I do when I'm teaching humanities, but I'm not sure that I've well articulated what it is I'm doing. So what do you think best practices in teaching humanities, both in terms of we're teaching graduate students how to teach the humanities and we're teaching students the humanities, what are we doing exactly?
Oh, God.
I hate that question.
Because as I was saying when we were chatting before we started, it always sounds so trite to me when we try and articulate that, and I'm not sure I articulate that very well. I started to, I'm at the kind of towards the end of my career, and writing this book, I had to articulate that I hadn't demanded of myself before. So I think, from my own sense is that when it's good, it's a collaborative think tank where kind of what you're trying to do is analyze things, read them, think about them, raise questions, create that environment. I'm not sure that, I won't claim that that's only the province of the humanities. That's what we should be doing all the way across the university. But there are ways in which humanists kind of demand that we take seriously the life of ideas, the life of cultural objects, the life of the historical, the anthropological, that there are, we say, this is what we are spending our time on. This is what we get passionate about. These are the kinds of questions we can ask of the objects we look at, or the processes we look at, or the text we look at, or the idea we look at. But aside from that, I can't come up with something slick that's about best practices for saying what we are doing.
Right. So I'm wondering, as you're speaking, maybe that's because the humanities in particular is against the slick, that one of the things that we're interested in is complexity. And I've often think about my father, who was an economist, and he used to say, simplify, simplify. But in the academy, in the humanities, we tend to say, let's complicate that idea. Mm-hmm. Right? And often I think, if we look at popular culture, we look at, trade books, the message is always simplify. And maybe that's the stand that we need to take, that really the message is complicate, because it's very complicated out there, as well as in the academy.
Yes, I think that's true. I just wouldn't claim that as only for the humanities.
Right.
We think of our colleagues in physics, for instance. Oh my God, how much they've had to complicate what it is that's out there that we're looking at. So we complicate it in a particular way, and maybe what we need to think about is what is the particular way in which we complicate it. And we are also, in a way, responsible for reanimating the heritage of the past. That's one of the things that the humanities does, that not all other parts of the university does, to say, we aren't done with anything yet. There's no doneness in the humanities. Yeah. We aren't done with the Greeks. We aren't done with early man. We aren't done with that. It's always there. It's always there to be reanimated.
Right. No, I really like that idea. When you were talking about physics or the sciences, I think physics and the sciences, they're much more oriented towards, we're done with that and now we're trying something new, right? Of course you have, the history of science and all of that, but they're very focused on, the current experiment, the current next move. And I think one thing we have to offer is this larger context. So we are always saying we're not done with Shakespeare. Right?
Well, and the other thing is, and I'm particularly interested in this because of my field, is that that we believe that we have something to say about the impact on human beings and on the world of certain ways of thinking in the other disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of the whole move towards narrative medicine,
Mm-hmm.
and how important it's becoming for medical schools to integrate a discussion, an exploration of particularly life writing by both doctors and people who have been in the position of the patient,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about thinking about language and how important language and issues of translation are to pursuing health with patients. I mean, there's always a way in which humanists can bring new ways of thinking to the table.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's exciting. I'm wondering, maybe a wind-up question would be, how can we take Okay, here's what I want to ask. I'm thinking about narrative and I'm thinking about storytelling as particularly a humanities area. And I'm wondering if maybe one way to talk about what we're trying to do or what we have to offer is through some sort of narrative. And I'm just wondering, do you have any stories of sort of the difference that the humanities has made to someone outside the academy?
Well, I'd rather think about the way in which people outside the academy are always, I mean, that's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about all the humanists out there, all the people who care about books, for instance, or care about the stories that they find in museums, who care about going on an archaeological dig, who care about different traditions of music and want to participate in them.
Mm-hmm. So maybe that's the story, right? It's that those people are being silenced by this louder cultural discourse of the humanities are a waste of time, they're not practical.
Absolutely. And it's really important. That's the part of what is important in doctoral training, is that we tell those stories. We turn ourselves to the outside world and we articulate this, and we talk to students about how to communicate their work to a larger public or different kinds of audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing that's really important that's why I think it's important to kind of spin around to my concern about doctoral education. That's why I think it's important to think about different kinds of dissertations, or dissertations that ask students to talk to different publics, or translate an idea across different kinds of writing, discourses and forms of address. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up here. If you don't mind, Kathryn, can I wrap it here?
Well, do you have a good story, Peter?
I don't actually, but because the humanities never ends, there'll be plenty more interviews to come in this series, and we'll have plenty more stories we're going to be able to tell. And by the next time, I'll come up with my story as well. But I think this is a good place, actually, a nice way to kind of end this really terrific interview with Sidonie Smith, and led by Kathryn Temple, and the first of many interviews in the Reinvent the Humanities to Help Change the World series by Georgetown University. So thank you very much from the folks here at Reinvent, and you've been a terrific, it's been a delightful conversation here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.